Sometimes the smartest answer is just another excuse to protect you from actually living. Will, a brilliant young man from a humble background, works as a janitor at a prestigious university. One day, the renowned Professor Gerald challenges his students to solve a difficult mathematical problem that has taken years to solve, and only a few have managed to do so. While cleaning the hallways, Will finds this mathematical problem on a blackboard, copies it, and takes it home, where he spends the night trying to solve it in front of his bathroom mirror. The next day, Will anonymously writes the solution on the blackboard. The correct answer surprises everyone, including Professor Gerald, who can't believe someone solved the problem so quickly. That gift that could open the world to him is not a source of fear. For Will, being seen is being vulnerable. Showing what he knows is equivalent to being exposed, and what is exposed always runs the risk of being destroyed. His life is seemingly simple and repetitive. The workday ends. He meets up with his friends, and together they repeat the same rituals. Drinking on weekends, sharing some laughs, getting into minor trouble, and chatting as if nothing else existed. His friends are like him, working class guys with humble jobs and limited horizons. Every day, Chuckie would get out of his car and walk to Will's door to look for his friend. This act might seem insignificant, but it's very important and will make sense later. After this, they reunited with the rest of the group. Will sees a former high school bully in a park who used to hit him when he was a kid and decided to confront him. His friends join in and a fight breaks out, but Will's impulsiveness leads him to severely beat the man. When a police officer tries to intervene, he attacks the officer as well, resulting in his arrest. Here, we see that Will is problematic, but as you know, human behavior has a reason, and little by little we learn more. Back at university, Professor Gerald's class is packed. Everyone is eager to discover who the math genius is, but no one raises their hand. Gerald then poses another, even more difficult equation on the board, hoping to attract the mysterious solver. Will solves the problem again, but Gerald catches him in the act, telling him to stop graffitiing other people's work. However, the boy flees before he can be confronted. Will is truly brilliant, capable of solving a theorem only a handful of people in the world can, but incapable of solving his own. An orphan with deep trauma, he learned to protect himself through sarcasm and solitude. It is the portrait of a young man trapped between his past and his potential, and above all, trapped by his fear, which leads to self-sabotage. In the very first scene, we're shown how he lives alone, sheltering behind closed blinds, where he feels free to be and do what he loves most. From the outside, we might think it's drinking or picking fights, but in reality, it's learning. It's as if the film shows us that Will's afraid to reveal who he truly is. He hides his motivations even for himself, since it's no coincidence that his job as a janitor at the prestigious university is an unconscious reflection of where he wants to be. But there's a contradiction within him, because when he's discovered by the professor, this fear of the unknown arises. Will knows this life, free of responsibility, a life that demands nothing of him, where he won't be a disappointment, that's his safe haven. That night, Will and his friends decide to go to a college bar packed with Harvard students. Chuckie tries to impress some Harvard girls, but Clark, an arrogant student, interrupts to show off his intellect by talking about economics and humiliates Chuckie. Will, well read on the subject, intervenes and refutes Clark with solid arguments, showing that Clark's ideas aren't original, but merely repetition of well-known authors. He then concludes by telling Clark it's sad he spent so much on education he could have gotten free at the public library. Clark, irritated, responds by implying that Will end up working flipping burgers, and Will challenges him to continue discussion outside. Clark backs down. However, Skylar, one of the students, is impressed by Will's intelligence and authenticity, so before leaving, she gives him her number, hoping to get to know him better. As he left, Will showed off his number to Clark, a nice victory that had him happy. The next day, Gerald inquired about Will, finding out days later that he was defending himself in court. To defend himself, Will cited cases from the 15th century, which impressed the judge. But what impressed him even more was Will's record. For years, he had been prosecuted for assault, car theft, impersonating a police officer, rioting, and many other things. Surprisingly, he had gotten away with everything by defending himself. Gerald, who was present, was very impressed. Will had been in several foster homes, although he had been removed from 3 of them due to serious physical harm. That was undoubtedly a terrible story. The judge wanted to be merciful to him, but since he had attacked a police officer, he couldn't help him. He would go to prison on a $50,000 bond. This uncontrolled violence may be due to the bad experiences he had in his adopted places, but we will learn more about that later. Hours later, Will called Skylar from prison. He wanted to know if she was studying law. The answer was no, although minutes later, Gerald visited him and would release him on 2 conditions. First, that he will help him with advanced math, and second, that he sees a therapist. Will found the latter ridiculous. However, Geralt told him it was that or serve his sentence. Obviously, Will chose to start helping Geralt. Their mathematical encounters begin, where they collaborate closely, proving to be a formidable team. In contrast, the therapy sessions are a challenge. For his first therapy session, Will researched his therapist, so when the man told him he was wasting his potential by getting into trouble, Will turned the situation around, implying that he was doing it because he wanted to come out of the closet. Having captured the man's attention, he told him he was lying, but he knew that the therapist was in the closet. Because of this, the therapist preferred to leave, which is why Geralt brought another, this time one who worked with hypnosis. But as you might guess, Will mocked him again. Will saw this opportunity Geralt gave him as a chance to test his true potential, but it also provided him with an escape route if he failed, sometimes to absolve him of responsibility. That's why, in addition to distrusting authority figures, he also does everything he can do to outsmart psychologists. In light of this, Geralt turned to Sean, a former colleague who was now a professor. At first, Sean said he didn't have time, but Geralt explained his importance with the story. Over 100 years ago, a man lived in India without a traditional education. One day, this man found a math book, and as if by magic, developed theories that astonished mathematicians, all from his humble hut and without any formal education, until a Cambridge professor discovered him, and by working together, they created the most exciting theories. The genius of that Indian man was unparalleled. Will was exactly like him, which is why he needed someone to win him over. Geralt told him that the boy was defensive and needed someone who understood him, someone with a similar background, like Sean. Days later, the first session begins. Will tries to intimidate Sean by showing off his intellect, asserting that he surrounds himself with the wrong books, but he fails to affect the therapist, who keeps pace and counters by always having the right answers. Will notices that Sean lifts more than him, and that he was also in Vietnam. Will continues digging to see what he finds. Then, he notices a painting by Sean of a person rowing in a storm. Will suggests that Sean might feel trapped in a personal storm, implying that perhaps Sean chose the wrong wife. This comment affects Sean, who warns Will to be careful with his words. But Will, having found a weak point, presses on about Sean's wife, asking if she left him or slept with someone else. Sean reacts angrily, grabbing Will by the neck and warning him not to disrespect his wife. The session ends abruptly and Will leaves. Geralt tells Sean that he doesn't have to continue with the sessions, but the therapist insists that Will will return on Thursday. Will was abandoned by his parents and suffered at the hands of his stepfather. Naturally, these traumas have created emotional barriers and distrust in new relationships, whether familiar, platonic, or therapeutic. He takes refuge in a safe world with his childhood friends, who likely share similar histories, viewing anything outside this circle as threatening. Will fears being abandoned or hurt as he was in his childhood, leading him to defend himself in two ways. First, it's by emotionally distancing himself and ending relationships before being abandoned, which we will see a little more in this in a bit. The second way is with violence, whether by attacking physically or psychologically. Having not processed his traumas, he sees authority figures as abusive and preemptively attacks. He does this with therapists to avoid being vulnerable. However, ironically, in trying to evade his fears, Will perpetuates them. As we've just seen, by attacking the therapist, he causes their rejection and strengthens his belief that they will always abandon him. This is an example of how people sometimes recreate fear situations, confirming their beliefs and thus justifying their emotional barriers due to the familiarity and control they offer. However, unlike the other therapist, Sean persists in continuing the sessions despite Will's hostility, and this breaks the pattern of abandonment that Will is familiar with, offering him a new perspective on relationships. Sean shows that not all relationships have to end in rejection, and also presents the possibility of authority figures or parental figures who provide genuine acceptance and care, something that would deeply impact him. That night, Sean couldn't help but drink, while, as Will had said, he invited Skylar out for candy. They really seemed to connect. After that, they both went for a burger, where Skylar asked him if he wanted a goodbye kiss. He replied no. In fact, he was hoping for a passionate moment. Of course, he was joking. He really did want a kiss, and the girl accepted. Only instead of a goodbye kiss, she gave it to him right then and there. Days later, a new session arrived, only this time in the park, outside in the real world. Here, Sean confessed that after the first session, he spent the whole night thinking about his words. But then he realized he was just a child who doesn't truly understand life yet. If he asked him about art, he would surely mention books, but he had no idea what the Sistine Chapel smelled like. If he asked him about women, perhaps he would mention that he had been passionate with one, but he couldn't tell him what it was like to wake up next to a woman and be truly happy. If he asked him about war, he would surely name Shakespeare, but he had never been near one. If he asked him about love, he would name a sonnet, but he had surely never looked at a woman feeling vulnerable, as if God had sent down an angel just for him, feeling he's her angel as well. He didn't know what love was, capable of enduring everything, even cancer. He didn't know what it was like to sleep in a hospital for 2 months holding her hand. He didn't know what true loss was, because that only happens when you stop thinking about yourself. Well, I see you, and I don't see someone intelligent and confident. I only see an arrogant and fearful boy. I know you're a genius, and no one will ever understand you, but you think you know everything about me through my paintings, like pretending to know everything about an orphan like you, just because I read Oliver Twist. I don't pretend I know everything about you from a book, unless you want to tell me who you really are. Will couldn't answer. This session needs to be examined in more depth, as something very interesting happens here. Sean reflected on his first interaction with Will and perceived that the young man's hostility hides a deeper fear of vulnerability. He understands this by noticing that Will was actually projecting his fears onto him, using Sean as a mirror to attack. Let's recall what happened. Will was inspecting Sean's surroundings and books, and projecting onto the therapist his own defense mechanism of hiding behind great authors to conceal his pain, just as Clark did, which doesn't make Will any better. Likewise, when Will noticed the painting and suggested that Sean was suffering an emotional storm due to abandonment or betrayal, the boy was actually projecting his own fears onto Sean. This is a clear example of how people sometimes attack in others what they find unpleasant or uncomfortable in themselves. Will could never have guessed that he suffered the loss of his beloved wife, because he had never suffered such a great loss. All he could do is project his problems onto others. With this understanding, Sean takes Will to the park, a place devoid of the shield of books. There, Sean becomes vulnerable by sharing his experience with the death of his wife. By showing the boy that being vulnerable isn't being weak, Sean lessens Will's perception of him as a threat. Sean demonstrates that beyond books and techniques, there are both genuine and vulnerable human beings with emotions and needs. After the second session, he will be shaken. He's too scared to call Skylar out of the fear that she won't accept him, and his fear of real intimacy, even choosing to lie to his friends about it. Will is now more aware that he's not as cool or experienced as he used to think. This defensive shield that he's developed is holding him back. In his next session with Sean, Will persists in his silence. Sean gives him space, hoping he will speak, but the session concludes without Will breaking his silence. However, at least now he doesn't appear hostile. It's key to highlight Sean's patience and respectful attitude. It's Will's turn to open up emotionally, but Sean doesn't pressure him. Many people tend to build emotional walls after certain trauma, so by not putting pressure on him, Sean is giving the boy time to open up his own pace by making him feel safer. On the other hand, Will continues to impress Gerald and his colleagues by solving complex mathematical problems, leaving them perplexed by his talent. In another session, Sean is still waiting for Will to open up. After silence, Will tells a joke that breaks the ice. So Will continues. Weeks ago, he had gone out with a girl, although he hadn't called her back. He was afraid of discovering she was boring. Sean picks up on this and suggests that Will might be using the same logic to avoid intimacy and genuine connection with others, fearing to disappoint them. For example, he knew his wife so well. In fact, she farted in her sleep. Once, she let out one so loud that she woke herself up. But because he loved her so much, he didn't want to tell her it was her. They both laugh, creating a stronger bond between them. Sean reminds him that those little quirks he misses the most. Those that might seem little imperfections to others, but to him, they are the details that make a person special. Sean then argues Will to consider that neither he nor Skylar are perfect, but what's important is whether they are perfect for each other. He advises him that the only way to find out is by giving their relationship a chance. In this scene, we see Will take an important step towards becoming more emotionally open when he finally speaks about why he's avoiding Skylar. Even though he approaches the conversation in a defensive way, Sean is able to recognize what is really going on beneath the surface. Will says he's worried about letting Skylar down, but that isn't the real issue. Deep down, his greatest fear is that if she truly knows him, she might reject him. Sean understands this, so he tells Will about his late wife and the flaws she had. By sharing these personal memories, he shows that nobody's perfect, and those imperfections are part of what makes relationships meaningful. Accepting another person's flaws, while also allowing them to see your own, creates trust and brings people closer together. Sean's message encourages Will to be honest with Skylar, instead of letting fear control his choices. Opening up to someone is never easy, because it means risking rejection, but also creates the opportunity for a genuine connection. When someone understands who you truly are, including your weakness, and still chooses to stay, it builds a deep sense of intimacy. In my opinion, that kind of mutual acceptance and vulnerability is the foundation of real love. Then, encouraged by Will, he goes to find Skylar, and they have a second date where they have an amazing time. However, Skylar asks Will about his family, but he's afraid to tell her that he's an orphan, so he lies, saying he has 12 siblings and lives with 3 of them. Days later, during another therapy session, Will asked Sean if he regretted meeting his wife, because of the pain he felt. The med said no, he didn't regret a single one of those days. When did you know she was the one? Will asked. Sean gave him the exact day. You see, the man remembered it because the day was the 6th game of the World Series, which is Team 1, a game that was historic. However, Sean had tickets for the game, but he didn't go with his friends because he stayed up talking to his future wife all night. The boy asked if it was worth it because Will fears abandonment, as he's already looking for a way out with Skylar, hoping that he can justify to himself that the relationship wouldn't be worth the pain. But for Sean, the pain of grief does not compare to the joy of having shared time with her. True failure isn't losing, but rather not trying. It's a beautiful metaphor for how his decisions to actively participate in life by taking risks, seeking love, and living without regrets, instead of just being a spectator of a game. Later, Will continues to develop his relationship with Skylar. She points out that she's never been to Will's house or met his family or friends, so Will decides to introduce her to his close friends, with whom they spend a fun afternoon. At the end of the day, Will suggests driving Skylar around in Chuckie's car. She suggests visiting his house, but Will, embarrassed by his home, suggests postponing it for another time. He's still afraid of disappointing her. The next day, Professor Gerald and Sean meet to discuss Will. Gerald begins to talk to the boy about his future, as job offers as a mathematician keep coming in. However, Sean believes that Will is not yet ready to take them on. Gerald insists that they must guide Will, so that he makes significant contributions to the world through mathematics. But Sean emphasizes the importance of Will choosing his own path instead of being manipulated. Gerald ended up leaving, mentioning that Will was already at the interview anyway. At least that's what he thought, since Will had sent Chuckie to negotiate for him, although the guy only asked for the guys for an advance, basically stealing from them. Meanwhile, Skylar and Will's relationship continued to deepen and intensify when Skylar proposes moving to California together. Given the seriousness of the proposal, Will reacts as usual. He feels she'll discover something about him she doesn't like and rejects the idea. Will responds that they wouldn't even end up together. He's just a poor guy she's having an affair with. Skylar makes it clear that she doesn't care about money. Her father died when she was 13 and she only inherited his money. However, she would trade everything for one more day with her father, so he shouldn't blame her for his fears. Skylar confronts him, admitting that she's also afraid their love won't work, but she's willing to try and be honest with Will, something he hasn't been able to do. Will responds that Skylar wouldn't want to know about his past. He has no siblings. He is an orphan. He suffered abuse at the hands of his stepfather. Skylar starts to cry and tells him she loves him and wants to help him, but Will lies again, telling her he doesn't love her, and leaves. Here, we see Will's fear of abandonment, leading him to expect the worst always and self-sabotage. The boy imagines being disappointing and being abandoned by Skylar, shifting the blame to others, first telling her that she's privileged because of her money, which backfires, which makes him repulse into his usual defense mechanism of abandoning and attacking rather than being abandoned or hurt. Later, Will gave Gerald the solution to a problem they had been trying to solve for quite some time. This pleased Gerald, but he still told Will that if he never needed to be called to a job, he should go himself, not his negotiator. Will replied that he shouldn't be called anymore. He didn't want to spend the rest of his life explaining things. Besides, all those problems were very easy for him. He regretted that others couldn't solve them, and without another word, he set the papers on fire. Gerald extinguished the flame. It was true. He couldn't think like Will, but he found it sad that all that talent was being wasted. Will ended up going with his friends, where, as you can imagine, he only wasted his time. The next day, he also turned down a job in national security. He wouldn't solve codes for him because what they were doing was questionable. Will explained in detail to Sean why he had turned it down, but Sean argued the topic and asked if he had a soulmate. Sean asked who in Will's life truly touches him on a deep level. The boy mentions several philosophers and poets, to which Sean points out the obvious. They're all dead, and he can't form a reciprocal relationship with them. Sean tells him he'll never have that kind of connection if he keeps on being afraid to take the first step, always anticipating negative outcomes. Sean then questions Will about what he really wants to do. Will is evasive, insisting he didn't choose his current situation, telling him that the bricklayer was an honorable job. However, Sean points points out his choices, all of the possible places he chose to clean the halls of a prestigious university and secretly solve complex math problems. This leads to the key question Will avoids: what he really wants to do with his life. But Will replied that he wanted to be a shepherd, which irritates Sean, leading him to throw the boy out of the office. Annoyed, Will said that he too was a failure. His wife had died, and he wasn't allowed to return to the game. "At least I played," Sean replied. "But what do you want to do? You see, you can't answer me. Goodbye." During this therapy session, Will leans heavily on rationalization to explain the choices he makes. He comes up with reasons that sound reasonable on the surface, but they also keep his real feelings hidden. For example, his decision to turn down the job with the National Security Agency is backed by arguments that make sense, yet Sean realizes the pattern goes far beyond that one situation. Will tends to imagine the worst possible outcome whenever a new opportunity appears, using those scenarios as an excuse to avoid taking risks. Deep down, those explanations protect him from facing his fear of leaving the life he knows and stepping into something unfamiliar. The same thing happens when Skylar asks him to move to California with her. Instead of admitting he's scared, Will focuses on the possibility that their relationship could fall apart. While that's a realistic concern, it's only one possible outcome. There's just as much chance that they could build a lasting future together, but he refuses to consider that, because it's safer to expect things to go wrong. Sean also realizes that Will secretly wants more out of his life. Even though he keeps himself at a distance from every opportunity, he spends his time at one of the country's top universities solving difficult math problems, yet never allows himself to become a student there. He hangs around university bars and proves he's smarter than many of the students, but never feels like he belongs among them. He falls for a woman he believes is perfect, but avoids fully committing to the relationship. Throughout all of this, Will clearly wants to grow beyond the world he's used to, but he stays on the sidelines because he's afraid of being judged, letting people down, getting hurt, or being abandoned, staying where he comfortably feels less risky than facing those possibilities. Sean understands exactly what's holding Will back and pushes him to see things differently. He makes Will realize that as long as he keeps expecting the worst and refuses to take on the first step, he'll continue missing out on meaningful relationships and the chance to truly change his life. After the session, Will calls Skylar to say goodbye before she leaves for California. During the conversation, he brings up his upcoming job interviews, almost as if he's trying to prove that he won't spend the rest of his life working construction. Skylar immediately makes it clear that none of that has ever mattered to her. She tells him she loves him, but once again, Will doesn't have the guts to say how he feels, ending the conversation. And the scene of him sitting alone on a bench, watching her plane disappear says far more than his words ever could. Even though he clearly cares about her, fear keeps him from acting, leaving him stuck between what he wants and what he believes is safer. A week later, Chuckie becomes the person who finally forces Will to confront the path he's choosing. At the construction site, he learns that Skylar has moved to California, and the conversation shifts towards Will's future. He mentions that he'll probably end up with a high-paying job someday, even if he feels like he's just going to be another lab rat. When Chuckie points out that almost any career would be better than spending the rest of their lives at a construction site, Will admits that he actually plans to stay in South Boston with the same friends he always had. Chuck refuses to accept that answer. He tells Will that if 20 years from now, he's still working construction and spending every weekend watching football with the same group of friends, it would be a tragedy. Unlike the rest of them, Will has an extraordinary talent and opportunities that most people never get. Chuckie sees those abilities as winning the lottery in life and believes throwing them away would be an insult not only to himself, but also to the friends who would gladly trade places with him if they could. He had a lottery ticket and wasn't cashing out of cowardness. Chuckie confesses that although he enjoys daily routine with Will, picking him up in the morning, what he looks forward to most is arriving at Will's house, knocking on his door, and discovering that the boy isn't there because he decided to go after something bigger. That afternoon, Will misses his meeting with Gerald, and Gerald, frustrated, confronts Sean about it. Gerald begins insulting Sean, blaming him for Will's departure. Sean explained that Will was just stressful because those who were supposed to love him most, his parents, had abandoned him. That's why he rejected people before they could abandon him. It was his defense mechanism. That's why they shouldn't pressure him. Also, the reason why he clings to his friends out of loyalty. Gerald accuses Sean of teaching Will that giving up is okay, and implies that Sean might be resentful for not having achieved what Gerald does. While acknowledging Sean's intelligence, Gerald feels he'll project his regret onto Will. Sean responds that he's satisfied with choices he's made in his life, and that his priority is Will's well-being, not the achievement Gerald expects of him. He insists he won't let Will feel like a failure. At that moment, Will enters and interrupts the heated argument. Garrett leaves, and Sean shows Will a file with photos of his body covered in bruises from his adopted father's abuse. Sean shares his own traumatic experiences, revealing that his father was an alcoholic and mistreated him and his mother. Will sees himself reflected on his own experiences with his adoptive father. Sean approaches the boy and assures him that nothing that happened to him was his fault. Will nods, but Sean asks him to look him in the eyes to reaffirm, "It's not your fault." Will replies he knows it, but Sean insists it's not your fault. The boy, trying to protect himself emotionally, pushes Sean away, but he continues to insist that the abuse wasn't Will's fault, until finally the boy breaks down, collapses in tears, and finds comfort in a hug with Sean. As smart as Will, who can solve the world's most complex theorems, he has always believed he was a failure for not finding a way out of that situation. He didn't have the answer, and he couldn't control anything, making it harder for him to trust others as well as his own decisions. Sean keeps repeating that it wasn't his fault, because Will, having had such a bad experience with different people throughout his life, probably thought that maybe he was the one with the problem. That moment, when he allows himself to cry and hug Sean, which he himself now considers a friend, is the first moment when Will stops running away. After that session, a weight was lifted from his shoulders. Will spends time reflecting and makes a decision. He visits Sean to tell him he accepted one of the job offers Gerald got for him. Sean asks if that's what he wants, and Will replies that he thinks so. The time for parting arrives. Will hopes that they stay in touch, and Sean, revealing that he'll be traveling for a while, shares a phone number where he can reach him immediately. They hug, thanking each other. Sean reminds Will to follow his heart. Will finds an alternative father figure, one who redefines the meaning of father into something more loving and understanding, allowing Will to open himself up to risk and new experiences, and explore a world beyond his small, safe environment. But it's important to remember that, as we noticed from the first session, Sean is a man in the midst of a personal storm. As we saw, he had closed himself off from the outside world and avoided risks since the loss of his wife. Curiously, the sessions with Will proved therapeutic for him, and like the boy, he decides to open himself to the world again, planning to travel and explore new possibilities. Telling Will that he wasn't to blame helped him, of course, because he wasn't to blame for his wife's death either. Later, Gerald visits Sean where they resolve their differences. Will's friends prepare a surprise for him, gifting him a modest but functional car that will serve him for his new life. But everything is about to change. Chuckie, as usual, goes to Will's house. He knocks on the door, but no one answers. After searching for another sign of his friend, he realizes Will is gone, and Chuckie can't help but smile. Before leaving, Will leaves a letter for Sean, explaining that he decided not to take the local job and will instead go to California in search of Skylar and new opportunities. Reading the letter, he can't help but smile, remembering his own decision to follow his heart, just as Sean did in his youth. Will chooses love and possibility over security and predictability. Will's friend's gift seems highly symbolic, a car representing his freedom and autonomy, indicating that Will is no longer limited to depending on others to go around. He now has the ability to make his own decisions and steer his own path. And similarly to how Sean left the baseball game to pursue a greater love, Will chooses to follow his heart.